All of these prints have been made using the Drypoint technique, which gets its name from the tool used, the Drypoint, that was used to scratch the image into the plastic printing plate. This is the Drypoint plastic. It's got a protective film on each side which needs to come off. You can then scratch into this plastic with the Drypoint tool to create your image on the surface. When you're making marks into the Drypoint plastic, think about varying the pressure of your lines. So you can scratch quite lightly, and these will print quite faintly. And a light pressure allows you to create quite loose and curved lines, as well as straight lines, but it allows you to loosen up the whole mark making. When you press a little bit more firmly, it's going to kick up a bit more plastic, and that's going to trap more ink and give you a much darker, more prominent line. It can be difficult to draw curved lines whilst keeping a lot of pressure on the Drypoint tool, but just take it nice and slow when you want to do curves that are going to be nice and prominent. Wherever you want crucial detail, you're going to need to make quite a firm mark in the plastic. One really useful aspect of using the Drypoint plastic is that you can actually trace images if you want to, either photographs or an image from a sketchbook. You can see that this technique gives a lovely atmosphere to your drawings, in part made by this plate tone that's left on the surface of the plate. The other lovely thing about using Drypoint is that you can go back to a plate that you've scratched a design into, and after you've taken a print, if you decide it needs a bit more detail, you can continue to scratch into the surface. This particular print, to get this kind of scratchy sky, I used a little bit of sandpaper to distress the surface of the plastic, and that just gives a different kind of mark. So you can be quite creative and inventive and look around the house for other objects that might give interesting marks to your plate. Tonal variation is the difference between the very lightest and the very darkest parts of a print, and there are a few different approaches. One approach to get dark areas within your print is cross-hatching, so lines that crisscross each other, and the denser the marks, the darker that area of the print. Another approach is shown here on this twig. Where it's very dark, I haven't actually scratched into the plate. I've just left lots and lots of ink on there, so lots of plate tone. And on the upper side of the twig, I've cleared back the ink. So I've cleared back the plate tone to let a bit more light through. So you could leave areas of your plate unscratched to allow you to play around with the plate tone when you get to the inking stage. So I've got my plate here, which I've scratched into quite a bit, and I've just put it on this black card so you can see the marks I've made a little bit clearer. I've got a bit of cross-hatching going on, I've got some straight lines, I've got some dots. We could use a bit of sandpaper and just see what texture that's going to be like. And I could even use a scalpel to incise a few lines and see if they're any different. Maybe use it across and maybe even scrape the blade over the surface. We'll see if that shows up any marks. So now we're ready to ink. Here's the ink. This is the stuff I use. It's made by Intaglio Printmaker, but I also sometimes use Caligo Safe Wash, and it's very similar. It comes in tubes like this or cartridges. It comes in tins as well, but I wouldn't recommend that because it dries really quickly. This is probably the most efficient way of using up every last drop of ink and not wasting any. This is just a little cut off piece of the Drypoint plastic, and I'm just dipping that into the ink to pick up ink along the edge of the piece, and then I'm dragging it over my plate. So cover right to the very edge of your plate and make sure you've worked it into all of the little scratches that you've put into the surface of the plate. Don't worry about the streakiness, we're going to even that out in the next step. So using a little bit of newspaper, I'm going to blot the surface of the plate. So just turning the newspaper over and rubbing the surface of the plate so that the paper will lift off lots of excess ink. The next stage in the process is to use a bit of what's called scrim. This is a loosely woven cloth with, and they call it a lint-free cloth because it doesn't leave trace little fibres over your work. This, as you can see, has been used before for a similar colour piece, so that's fine. And I've got just a rag bundled up inside just to give it a little bit of cushioning. And I'm going to put all the loose ends behind and use this area to just to even out the ink across the plate. I also like to have a stash of scrap paper that I can use to hold down the plate without getting my fingerprints in the way. So the first thing I'm going to do is just push the ink and give the scrim a bit of a twist so that it pushes the ink into the marks I made on the surface. And you can see that's taken away all of those streaks that were there, and it's just given us an even covering of ink across the surface of the plate. Once you've got to this stage, it's a good idea to have some scrap plain paper to hand so that you can see the progress of your inking on the plate. Now I'm going to use this again, but I'm going to choose a relatively cleaner area of cloth, and instead of pushing and twisting, I'm going to gently move the cloth round and round in little circular motions. And where I've done that, you'll see it's an even smoother texture on the surface of the plate. So if there are areas where you want to keep this sort of rougher texture, that's absolutely fine. And it will be slightly darker in the print, but I'm going to try and reveal most of the marks we made. I'm going to use a clean piece of scrim. So I'm just polishing the ink away, polishing the plate tone away to reveal more of the scratches I made on the surface. And that's probably where I'll leave it in terms of polishing. So I'm going to show you how to put in a few highlights now, and the first thing I'm going to show you is this using this cotton bud. So this takes off quite a lot of ink and leaves a nice bright mark. So you can have, if I just hold that, you can have bright spaces within all that plate tone just by clearing it away. You might find you have to swap ends quite frequently, otherwise you'll be putting that ink back on to the plate. So I'm just done some little dots, but you could also do some sort of swirls, play around a bit to see what different marks you can make. I also sometimes use these little cut-offs of mount card, and you can put in some really nice interesting marks with this, either just by using the corner like that, or by using the flat edge. You can get some really interesting marks there if I hold that up. So the next stage is to print this, and for that we need to dampen some paper. So this is some heavyweight printing paper. It's specialist etching paper, and it's about 300 grams, and it's resting in some water right under the surface to make it nice and soft. And it's been in there for a couple of minutes, so I'm going to bring it out of the water now. I use these small folds of card so that I don't get any fingerprints on the paper. Drip the excess water into the bowl and scrape the excess water off with a squeegee. And then this is a stack of blotting paper, so I just put it under there, take away the piece of card, and you want to try and squeeze all the excess moisture out of the paper so that it's just damp. You don't want wet paper, you just want damp paper. So here's the plate, and it's sitting on the bed of the etching press, and I put a piece of paper underneath, a white piece, so that I've got a guide when I place the printing paper on the top. I've put the plate centrally, and I'm going to put the printing paper centrally as well. This way I can make sure that I've got a decent border around the edge of the printing plate, so I can trim it down to whatever size I need. The etching press has got felt blankets that go over the top, and now I'm going to wind the bed of the press so that it goes underneath this roller. You can see an emboss as the plate has pushed into this printing paper, which shows me that it's a good tight pressure. So now I'm using the folded card again to peel the paper back, and you can see that all those marks and all that texture has transferred to the print, and it's come out really clearly. So let's have a closer look at the print, and maybe the first thing that you'll spot is that it's a mirror image of the plate. So what was on the left is now on the right, and that's quite important when you're thinking about composition, particularly if you're doing a landscape that you want to be recognisable, or text in your work. But in this case it doesn't matter too much. This is the sandpaper, this very scratchy mark, and this is the Drypoint tool, these very dense dark marks. The finer marks here, I think I made those with the scalpel, so they're a bit thinner, and there's just some very faint lines there where I scraped the scalpel on its side. The dots have come out quite clear, quite well, and that's all the marks that I made into the plate itself. And then when I got to the plate tone, I was using cotton buds, so a cotton bud made these dots here and these nice swirls, and they've come out quite bright. And it was a little piece of mount card that made these squiggles, and it was using the edge of the mount card to sort of scratch that mark in there. So this is a really good way to start using Drypoint. Just make an experimental plate where you find out what the effects of the different tools are and how you can bring in these monoprinting techniques to create highlights. And using that knowledge, you'll then be able to go on and put together some sort of composition, whether that's abstract or a realistic drawing is entirely up to you. You can also bring in other colours to Drypoint. So this one's got a couple of techniques. We've got 2 different colours of ink used to bring a bit of light into the picture. And we've also got what's called chincolle, which is a way of embedding tissue paper within the print. And this can be quite abstract, like these 2 prints. Or it could be as part of a more detailed composition, more illustrative effect. People also sometimes paint over their Drypoint prints, and this one's just had a wash of Indian ink, but you could paint in as much or little detail as you wanted.